absolutely. Makes perfect sense to me. I'd like to take up on that because I quite understand your approach, and it's an approach that I respected in terms of, don't come with band-aid solutions. And some solutions that we adopt in this society, like, for example, charity on a big scale, and I say again, while it is needed at this time, but in the end, it too is really a band-aid approach. Are there any first principle moves that could be made to fundamentally shift the approach to this whole problem? I'll give you an example that for me, and I'd like to see whether you agree or not. For example, the quite libertarian approach that the ANC, our government, has taken since independence towards the food system. In other words, saying, look, let the market rule. If they became more involved and intervened more in the right way, do you think this could make a fundamental change to the way things are panning out in hunger and food?
Look, I think another point to make is that there are markets and there are markets. So there's not the market, and then the opposite of that is no market. There are different kinds of markets. And it's not to say that a possible solution is not to be found in markets. A market is just a place where people exchange goods and services for money, or sometimes for other goods and services. It's just a means of exchange. So it's not to say that markets are not part of the solution, because what we have at the moment is not the market. We have a market. We have a very particular kind of market system. There are all around the world very different ways for people who produce food to interact with the people who buy food. In South Africa, we only have one of those forms of market. And in fact, it's a market system that is not just detrimental to poor households, it's also very detrimental to small-scale farmers and to, in fact, any kind of small-scale business in the food system. So it's not to say that the opposite of what we have is no markets. In fact, the opposite to what we have is different kinds of markets. So we have all sorts of systems in place that privilege this market, this dominant market, over other kinds of markets. And we've seen examples of those through the years. So the Competition Commission had a big investigation into the supermarket's dominance of space in shopping centres. And essentially what the supermarkets would do is sign a lease that forced the landlord to keep out any small food traders, and thereby keeping their monopoly on the market. We have a logistics system and a trading system which effectively makes it very difficult for small-scale farmers to reach their customers. We don't have the kind of organized food marketplaces in our urban centers that you see all around the world, whether it's France or Italy or the United States or Canada or Brazil. We don't see any of those forms of market structure. So it's not so much about saying we don't need markets. I think it's more that we need different kinds of markets. And once again, it's about saying what kinds of markets are going to work for the benefit of the majority of people in the system, which is poor households and small farmers and people who work in agriculture, which means we need a different kind of imagination around this. But once again, it's about understanding what are the real issues. What are the real issues here? So let's have a look at what some of those are. So if you understand the reality of many people's lives in urban areas, the real demand is not for fresh food to cook. It's for ready-made food. Okay, so we already have a lot of people in township economies that are involved in preparing ready-made food, but they get no support from the state. The only people who get support are sort of like the chains selling basically unnutritious fast junk food, as opposed to street food, which is a very different thing and often is very nutritious. There's no support at all. There's no infrastructure. There are no basic services. There's nothing. Whereas there is this whole informal economy of food providers that are cooking and selling food that is actually very affordable for people, but we don't support them. Okay, so there's one thing. We don't do enough, I think, to address child malnutrition. Child malnutrition is incredibly detrimental. It increases our public health burden. More than a quarter of the public health burden in South Africa, which taxpayers are paying for if they worry about those sorts of things, comes from non-communicable diseases related to diet. And the main reason for that is because people cannot afford to eat healthy food, not because people are too stupid to understand what a healthy diet is. Children who are malnourished are unable to learn in school. There's a proven link between chronic childhood malnutrition and an increased propensity for violence in adults. The strain of hungry children mostly takes its toll on women, who have the primary responsibility to feed children, creating depression and all sorts of other negative things. So addressing child malnutrition is a very important step. And it needs to be done before children enter school and the school feeding scheme, because the damage is done before most children start school when they're 6 or 7 years old. The damage is done before then. And certainly this cannot be an impossible problem to address, particularly in urban and small town areas where you've got a concentration of people. You already have a move to try and support early childhood development centres. There are allowances for this. There have to be, just a minimum amount of thinking about this would understand that there are many, many ways to support child malnutrition, reduce child malnutrition at the same time as supporting local producers and as creating livelihood opportunities for women in those communities. This cannot be a difficult solution. And in terms of bang for your buck, it could probably involve an investment of hundreds of millions, even R1 billion by the state, with enormous returns in terms of a decreased public health burden, reduced poverty, reduced inequality, reduced domestic violence levels, etc., etc., etc. So it's a really good investment for the state to make. But once again, it can't happen unless there is some kind of understanding of what drives these outcomes. At the moment, the thinking seems to be that the childcare grant is fine for addressing that. You cannot feed a child even the most basic nutritious basket of food for anywhere near the childcare grant, or that we must somehow educate people about how to feed their children, as if the only problem is that they're too stupid to understand what a healthy meal is. So this is something where you can have an intervention. You can ensure that more children are in early childhood development centres because they're better fed. You can create many livelihood opportunities for children, and you can make a real difference. So for me, that is one of the areas that seems kind of like a no-brainer. And you can do all sorts of other things. That is a way to have linkages to urban agriculture. There are all these small cooking and food preparation enterprises run by women that can then be leveraged up into something for that. But, you have to have a bit of imagination, and you have to see what the real problem is and the opportunities of the solution. Now, to go back to what you were saying about a market, is that whole thing is still a market environment. It's people exchanging goods, it's creating demand and supply. Yes, you would probably have a subsidy component, but there's an existing subsidy component for meals in early childhood development centres. It's just extremely poorly envisaged and run. So it's not as if saying that we need to replace the market with the not market. It's that we need different kinds of markets that work better for more people.
Yeah. So Tracy, what you're saying is music to my ears, and I think that the thing that I get out of that, which is so important to us in SA Harvest and me personally, is that in fact our belief that for the government to fulfill Section 27 in terms of food is not something that's out there in space, a Mars-type, initiative. There are real things that can be done, and not too simply. And I think that, if I hear you correctly, that if we were to make a formal constitutional demand on the government to fundamentally change the situation in South Africa, it would be a realistic quest. Do you agree with that? They have
Yes.
the resources to do something about it.
Yes, we're not going to reduce South Africa's food insecurity and hunger rates to zero overnight. That is not going to happen. But we sure as hell can do better than we're doing at the moment. That's for sure. And given the socioeconomic implications of the current situation, it really should be a priority. And with just a little bit of imagination, a little bit of thinking, and a little bit of prioritization of resources, a significant improvement can be made. So, for the state to say, well, of course, we can't fix hunger and food insecurity and use that as an excuse to do nothing, is a little feeble, frankly. So I really think that the application of the mind to the problem, and yes, it does take resources, but it doesn't necessarily take the most outrageous amount of resources. You can be clever about these things. And secondly, you've got to think about all of the money that the state is currently spending on trying to reduce poverty, reduce inequality, create livelihood opportunities, improve public health, reduce domestic violence. Whereas this intervention in food could actually help to address a lot of those issues at the same time in a relatively cost-effective fashion. Plus create more livelihood opportunities for women, for small-scale farmers, all of the good things that we want to achieve. It really is an intervention that can achieve a lot of benefits. And if you look at the amount of money that is being spent across sectors on kind of nutrition education, supporting early childhood development, feeding schemes with not too much, useful impact there because it's not at scale, and so there's no economies or efficiencies. The money that's spent on trying to create employment opportunities for women, the money that's spent trying to improve gender equity, the money that's spent to try and reduce domestic violence, the money that's spent to try and improve education outcomes in school, the money that's spent to try and improve the non-communicable disease burden, etc., etc. This seems like a really small intervention that can have a big impact. And frankly, in an environment where we do have, a limited fiscal envelope, these are exactly the types of interventions we should be prioritizing. We should be prioritizing interventions where every rand that's spent in it gets a disproportionate amount of value at the end.
All right. So, Tracy, thank you so much. I mean, for me, on the one side, you bring out the reality, which is catastrophic. But on the other side, your message for me is a very positive one, very positive indeed. We can do it. So thank you so much for agreeing to be our first guest in conversation with SA Harvest.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
That's only a pleasure.
Thanks, Alan.